When It Happens is a short story by Margaret Atwood. When It Happens is a dystopian fiction set in 1969 on a fictional unnamed farm. It is from a third-person perspective focused on the reveries and dread of Mrs. Borage, who prepares for survival from an uncertain future threat. Do like and subscribe. The timeline of this short story and the reasons behind Mrs. Borage's strong survival instincts reflect the period known as the Great Depression, spanning from 1929 to 1939. Which was triggered by a stock market crash that led to the collapse of economic institutions, ushering in immense poverty and shortages of essential goods. In the aftermath, individuals who weathered this economic crisis sought self-sufficiency to protect against potential future hardships. Similarly, survivors of World War II harbored cynicism towards the media due to wartime propaganda. Mrs. Borage's concerns about explosions and distant smoke reflect prevalent anxieties from the Cold War era, which spanned from 1947 to 1991. The short story begins in anticipation of an impending frost. The 51-year-old Mrs. Borage ventures out into the chilly night to harvest all the green tomatoes she can find, amassing over 3 bushels. Despite being capable, she enlisted her husband Frank to carry them indoors, a task he gladly accepted. Using last year's jars, she diligently prepared pickled green tomatoes, a routine she had maintained since 1952 when she first acquired her garden. However, a strike at the factory hindered the acquisition of more jars. The looming threat of rising prices due to frost-damaged crops weighed on Mrs. Borage's mind. Mrs. Borage refrained from teasing Frank about his weight, aware that their time together was limited. Despite Frank's stubbornness, he remained kind and pleasant, prompting Mrs. Borage to avoid confronting him about fixing a broken step or requesting firearm training. As economic challenges loomed and physical ailments accumulated, Mrs. Borage found herself contemplating the uncertainties of the future, subtly observing the pervasive sense of helplessness among other women in town. The approaching trip to town for shopping triggered musings about the possessions she would have to leave behind, including cherished gifts and heirlooms. Concerns for her daughter's futures added to the weight of her thoughts, as she hoped they wouldn't bring children into what she perceived as a difficult time. Mrs. Borage yearns for the ability to prepare for the uncertain future that threatens ahead. In her imagination, she predicts the cessation of airplane flights, the quieting of the highway's noise, and a censored television providing limited information. Anticipating the end of gas and oil, she instructs Frank to retrieve the old wood stove from beneath the barn and gather firewood from dead trees. As the telephone wires fall, unrepaired, and men traverse the back road heading north, she discontinues chaining the dogs and discreetly hides the shotgun behind the barn. Gas conservation begins, accompanied by the distasteful task of preparing and consuming the chickens they once raised. The absence of electricity signifies a grave situation in Mrs. Borage's mind, and she salvages what she can as her world plunges into darkness. Eventually, smoke signals trouble, and when neighbors arrive seeking Frank's help, she withholds the shotgun, sensing his departure is final. Understanding that her home is no longer safe, Mrs. Borage dons warm clothing, gathers essential supplies, and contemplates the grim fate that awaits her deserted property. With uncertainty surrounding her, she goes on a journey north, passing the cemetery where her family rests. As she heads into the evening, doubts arise, yet she adds seemingly mundane items like oatmeal and shortening to her list, a reminder of life's basic needs. Seeking refuge in the forest, she encounters a spark of fire and 2 men, their intentions unclear. Armed with the shotgun, Mrs. Borage wrestles with fear and the unknown, reflecting on the unpredictability of one's actions in such dire circumstances. The narrative leaves her poised for a confrontation when it suddenly transports back from Mrs. Borage's imagination to the present drab reality. She scribbles cheese on the grocery list before looking out the kitchen door. Let's analyze this short story. When It Happens portrays an extreme manifestation of the inability to exert control over the future. Mrs. Borage, driven by an intense desire for autonomy, meticulously manages her self-sustaining home, complete with livestock for food and milk, a gas pump, and ample storage space. Despite her efforts, a persistent unease gnaws at her, fueled by concerns that her provisions might not be sufficient, and she toils to amass surplus goods. However, this perpetual cycle only exacerbates her anxieties, creating a paradoxical situation where attempts at control yield more perceived problems. Mrs. Borage struggles with her own limitations, especially the realization that relying on Frank for protection is no longer feasible given his advancing age. Though yearning to learn how to use a gun for self-defense, she hesitates to ask Frank for guidance and struggles even in her fantasies to overcome the mental barrier of pulling the trigger. Amidst her fears, Mrs. Borage senses an impending calamity, prompting her independent actions to fortify her environment. The hidden shotgun and provisions suggest her readiness to face the unknown, possibly fueled by an ambiguous fear of a nuclear war or a catastrophic event leading to isolation. Living in constant fear, Mrs. Borage maintains a solitary existence, devoid of visitors, and contemplates an escape plan she never executes. At 51, she clings to self-preservation, acknowledging that unforeseen circumstances might leave her alone, forcing her to fend for herself in an uncertain future. Mrs. Borage feels beleaguered, isolated, like someone shut up inside a fortress, suggesting Mrs. Borage's profound sense of loneliness and isolation. Her feelings extend beyond mere alienation. She perceives herself as actively under attack. While she experiences geographical isolation from the external world, residing in her remote farmhouse, her lonesomeness goes beyond the typical sense of seclusion. She feels disconnected from the women in the town who prefer ready-made products while Mrs. Borage cans and pickles her jars. Also, none of the neighbors could be tagged as friends or confidants of Mrs. Borage. Mrs. Borage feels physically isolated and emotionally detached from her husband, Frank. Despite being married, their connection is marked by a significant emotional gap. Frank, more inclined to live his life outdoors, leaves Mrs. Borage anchored indoors, amplifying the sense of separation between them. Their marriage has lost the spark it once had, and there is a visible communication gap between the two. Mrs. Borage's suggestions are often dismissed by Frank, who seems to view himself as superior, asserting control solely based on his gender. The dynamics between Mr. Borage and Frank reveal a lack of equality and meaningful communication, with Frank's dominance rooted in traditional gender roles. Trapped in a loveless marriage, Mrs. Borage constantly worries about the threatening future. Despite outwardly appearing without cause for concern, the media reports, the anxious expressions of town women, and apocalyptic visions written in Watchtower paper fuel her belief that a dreadful event is imminent. In her mind, she envisions embarking on a solo journey armed with a gun, encountering men she feels compelled to shoot. Fantasies of secrecy and abandonment of Frank during a catastrophe emerge, rooted in the monotonous cycle of her marriage. These vivid survival scenarios occur within her thoughts as she casually compiles a grocery list, creating a stark contrast between her fantasy world and reality. Her intense desire for preparedness and control stems from past struggles during the Great Depression and war, as she remains trapped in those experiences, dreading their return. Despite genuine fears, when it happens hints at the excitement these doomsday daydreams bring to her tedious life, with grown children and Frank's diminished demands. Mrs. Borage, fixated on the back window, anticipates signs of an impending apocalypse, revealing the impact of monotony on her psychological state. While her catastrophic predictions never materialize, the lasting effect on Mrs. Borage becomes palpable as even mundane tasks, like creating a grocery list, transform into exercises in apocalyptic survival thinking, highlighting the lasting influence of her apocalyptic fantasies. Hope you like, share and subscribe for more videos.